And I'm going to be your MC for the program. I just wanted to do a little early pioneers and settlers of this area. Just a couple of things. We've got some tables in the back. The Osseo Historical Society has also contributed, and they provided some really neat pictures of Pierre Bottineau in the back. The Oxbow has a table. They have some information about a tour they're going to be giving this fall, a wonderful tour of Quebec and French Canada. We've also got a table back. The French American Heritage Foundation has a table back with books for sale and a sign-up list if you want to get your email list signed up. If you want to hear about more of the events that we're putting on, go back to our table and sign up there. The Maple Grove Historical Society also has a table. They have some books for sale, and it's wonderful that we're doing this together here today. So now I'm going to introduce our first speaker, and I'm really excited to do this. Pierre Girard. He's been a long lover of French heritage, French Canadian history in Minnesota. He was past president of the Société Canadienne Française. He's a member of the Canadian Errant, a French singing group. He's currently a member of the French American Heritage Foundation. And he's going to come up here and talk a little bit, kind of give a little prelude, a little story in the history of Pierre Bottineau. So, Pierre, you want to come up and talk a little bit about Pierre Bottineau? I'm going to introduce Pierre Girard.
Thank you very much, Mark. Bonjour, ladies and gentlemen. Bonjour. My name is Pierre Girard, have you heard? I originally came from Wisconsin. My grandfather came from Quebec, Saint-Ursule, and my grandmother came from Prairie du Chien. We're here to learn a little bit about and celebrate kind of the life of Pierre Bottineau. I'll give you a short introduction of what I know, and then Dr. Virgil Benoit, he'll give us information on the real Pierre Bottineau. How many of you are French Canadians? Nice to see. Okay. How many of you wish you were French Canadians? There you go, thank you. Okay. The Bottineau ancestors were Huguenots in France. Everybody know who the Huguenots were? They were the Protestants who lived in France. And at times, from 1598 until 1685, it was okay to be Protestant in France. There was skirmishes and wars and things like that. But in 1685, King Louis XIV, Louis XIV, he invalidated the Treaty of Nantes, which meant that the Protestant church was no longer protected or welcome in France. And so a lot of French people who were Protestant, they figured there was close to 1 million of the French people that were Protestant. They were Calvinist, like Presbyterian type of Protestantism. They began to leave France. There were a lot of them that were killed before they got out of France, and then a lot of them that converted because they didn't want to leave France, and then the rest of them left. And some of them came to the United States, some of them actually went to Quebec. They kind of went all over the world. They went to other countries. Well, the Bottineau family, they immigrated to an area around Boston, Massachusetts. That's where they decided they were going to live. And they were loyalists to the King and Queen of England. And so at the time they were living in Boston was when the colonies decided that they no longer wanted to be under the umbrella of the King and Queen of England. And so the Revolutionary War took place. And it was after the Revolutionary War that the Bottineau family decided to move up into Canada because they were loyalists. They did not want to separate from England. So they moved to Canada. And eventually, Pierre Bottineau's father, who was Charles Joseph Bottineau, he decided that he wanted to move to the north, what was called the Northwest area, the Northwest Territories, and that was the area of northern Minnesota, North Dakota. It was mainly where the Chippewa or Ojibway Indians were living. And he wanted to move there. So he moved and went to the area around Pembina. Now, got to check my notes here. Pierre was born in 1817, and he was born in the area of Grand Forks, actually at the mouth of the Turtle River. And he was born during what was called a buffalo hunt, when all the French and Métis people who lived in the Grand Forks area and northern Minnesota, Pembina, they would gather together and they would go out into North Dakota and they would have these huge buffalo hunts. And then it would actually take them several weeks. And they would load up with all the buffalo meat and all the hides and everything, and then they would come back to Pembina and to the Red River Colony, and that was their food, and also the buffalo hides. They traded in the buffalo hides. And so that would see them through the winter. They would make their clothing and their tents and everything out of the buffaloes, and what they didn't sell, or what they didn't use, they sold. So that was a big thing that took place, and it was on one of those hunts when Pierre was actually born. He grew up on the Red River in the area of Pembina, North Dakota. And over his lifetime, he worked as a guide and an interpreter, and he was a real trailblazer. And one of his first long trips was from the Red River Colony, which was Winnipeg, down to Prairie, which is in southern Wisconsin. He was 13 years old when he made that trip. He was a messenger for the Northwest Fur Company. He married for the first time in 1836 at St. Boniface, which is actually a part of the city of Winnipeg now. And he married a woman, a Métis woman, whose name was Genevieve Laurence. And after the death of Genevieve, she died during childbirth, giving birth to twins. He again married in 1852 to Martha Gervais. In all, he fathered 23 children between the two wives. Now, Pierre's father, Charles, was French. But his mother was Marguerite, and she was the daughter of a Sioux warrior who had been captured by the Ojibway. And so this Sioux warrior was adopted by the Ojibway tribe and lived with them, and then his mother was an Ojibway woman. So Pierre's mother was full-blooded Indian. Pierre eventually moved from the Pembina area to Fort Snelling. In the Fort Snelling area in 1840, he moved to that area. He came down with a lot of people who were from the Selkirk colony, which was up around Winnipeg, and they decided, because of bad farming, they had had a few years of real bad farming, they moved down to Fort Snelling. And there was a lot of trade actually taking place between Winnipeg and St. Paul. So these people were used to hearing about Fort Snelling and St. Paul. So he was instrumental in coordinating with other French Canadians and Métis people in building the chapel over in St. Paul in 1841. The Chapel of St. Paul, which eventually the city took the name. And he lived in downtown St. Paul. He had quite a bit of land. He had several lots. And he sold the lots, but he didn't make a lot of money on them. But he lived there for about 5 years. And then he went over, moved his family to St. Anthony, which is now a part of Minneapolis. In St. Anthony, he owned a bunch of land, and at one time they said he owned about 700 acres in northeast Minneapolis. There again, he started selling off the land. That's kind of how he made his money. But he was very instrumental. They said he was like the second settler in Minneapolis after Franklin Steele. So he worked with Franklin Steele, and they helped create the city of Minneapolis. He donated the land for a St. Anthony of Padua church in northeast Minneapolis and helped get that church started. Then he stayed there until 1854. And it was in St. Anthony when his first wife passed away from childbirth. And so he remarried the same year, and he married Martha. And they started having children. Okay, in 1865, then he moved out to Osseo, the Osseo area, and which now, a lot of the area where he owned land is now part of Maple Grove. He came out here, and that was in 1854, and in 1855, he supervised the building of a church in Osseo. The church at that time was called St. Louis, and eventually it became St. Vincent. But it was St. Louis. Did I turn that off? Oh, it cut out. Oh, whoops. All right. Okay. The area that he moved to here in Maple Grove, Osseo area, was called Bottineau Prairie. And it was supposedly really beautiful land, and he loved it here. So he stayed for 20 years in Bottineau Prairie. And he eventually had the 23 children, but then he again decided that he wanted to move. And so in 1876, he took a group of French-speaking people on ox cart trains that he knew from the Osseo area, and he went up to the old crossing area on the Red River in northern Minnesota. And then he went to Winnipeg, and he got some other French-speaking people and brought them to Red Lake Falls and created the town of Red Lake Falls. He also was instrumental in starting St. Joseph's Church in that community. As I said, he was an interpreter, a guide, a farmer, and a voyager, an arbitrator, and he spoke several languages. He spoke French, he spoke English, he spoke Michif, he spoke Chippewa, Cree, Assiniboine, English, Dakota, many of the other native languages. He could speak them all, so he was really always welcomed by everyone because he could speak with everyone. He was able to keep everyone calm and work together with people to make a better life for everybody. He also worked for Henry Sibley. And he worked for Alexander Ramsey when Alexander Ramsey was the first governor of Minnesota. And one of the things that he did that a lot of people don't know is that he was a survey scout for the James J. Hill Railroad, the Northern Pacific. He actually went out there and decided what route they would take to get out toward the Pacific. Because of his diplomatic skills, he was known as the walking peace pipe. And that's because he could speak to anybody. He could calm any situation that needed calming. In 1854, when he was here at Osseo, he built the first wood-framed house here in Maple Grove. And that house is now up in the Elm Creek Park Reserve, the original house from 1854. It went through a lot of different lives of its own. It was a storehouse, it was a granary, it was all other things, but now it's been restored, and it is his house, and it's actually in very good condition. And when he lived in this area, he also was a founder of what was called Orono Village, which was up at Elk River. He bought an inn in Elk River, he built a house in Elk River, he built a new inn in Elk River, and that was started in 1849 until he left the area here. But he enjoyed going out creating cities and working with people, and so he actually, in addition to Elk River, was instrumental in creating Breckenridge, Minnesota, Wahpeton, North Dakota. He died at the age of 78 in 1895, and that was at Red Lake Falls, Minnesota. He's remembered and honored with namesakes like Bottineau, North Dakota, Bottineau County, Bottineau Library in Minneapolis, Bottineau Park in Minneapolis, Bottineau Boulevard, Highway 81. And so a eulogy in the Minneapolis Journal said about Pierre Bottineau, he was one of the last ones of that long line of hardy pioneers which the French had given to America. Thank you.
I would like to present Virgil Benoit, a professor emeritus from the University of North Dakota. I think we all know Virgil Benoit. I guess he's famous in Minnesota. He's been very active, involved in French-Canadian heritage events as long as I've known him. He has given numerous talks and lectures on things French-Canadian and is associated and one of the founders of Oxbow, AFRAN, and initiatives in French Midwest. He has been the driving force behind organizing a French festival up in Hewitt, Minnesota, called the Chautauqua, every year in August, and I think he's been doing that for over 30 years. He's been recognized, and this is what always amazes me, he's been recognized by the governments of Canada, France, and Quebec. I can't even be recognized by my wife. Just kidding. He holds such honors as Les Palmes Académiques, L'Ordre de Francophone d'Amérique, La Médaille, the Conseil de la Vie Française d'Amérique, and John Tremblay is going to tell me that I didn't pronounce these names right.
We'll talk.
And the Teacher of the Year Award in Minnesota in 2000 from the American Association of Teachers in French. Today, Virgil is going to give a presentation on finding the real Bottineau. Ladies and gentlemen, Virgil Benoit.
Yeah, I'm Virgil Benoit. I'm extremely cautious to speak before a group. I could say, before I thank some of you, that I have spoken to a lot of groups in the past. I was identified by the superintendent of education in North Dakota at a teachers' meeting in Bismarck. I think it was 1982 or something like that. And he leaned over from the next table where he was, and he says, "Why don't you portray Pierre Bottineau?" No, I said, "All right, if you want me to do it." He said, "The teachers would enjoy it very much." And so I ended up doing that for the North Dakota State Historical Society. I think, however, it's the Historical Society of North Dakota. It's the Minnesota Historical Society. But it's the Historical Society of North Dakota. There's quite a difference there if you think about it. I won't get into that. I want to thank a few people right away. First of all, the people of the parish of St. Joseph the Worker. When I met the two parish priests who seem to be significant here, I didn't meet the many, many others who are also significant. I was very pleased to let them know that anybody with such a facility as this should be doing a lot of good in the community. I want to thank the Maple Grove Historical Preservation Society. I've met a few of you today, and thank you. The French American Heritage Foundation of Minnesota, and thank you, Mark, and all the members of that association and members of the board of directors who are here. I want to thank especially Michelle Royce and Doug Royce, who are here from Fargo, representing the Louisville Foundation at Old Crossing, also known as the Oxbow. I want to thank Nanette McCann and Deborah McCann for the endless information they have sent me on Bottineau over the years. And thank you, Pierre, for saying everything. You've made my task almost impossible. I want to thank some close friends of mine, John Tremblay and Bob Dietrich. They're over here on the table to my right, and there are many other friends who'll excuse me if I don't name you as well. But if you are interested in going out to supper after it is time to do such, please contact John Tremblay, who's at the table here. I know some people are going out to a restaurant which has been chosen already. It's not very far from here. Everyone is welcome to do that, but please contact John. You may want to call the restaurant. On April 27th, just a few weeks from now, the Oxbow will host writer Charles Siaraki, who is from Hugo, Minnesota, but he was a professor of English literature throughout his career. He comes now from Charleston, South Carolina, and he'll deliver a talk on a topic that interests me, and I know it interests many of you. Because as follow-up to the question that Pierre gave, we could ask another question. How many of you have mixed ethnic spouses, or your marriages of a mixed ethnic makeup? And I bet you most of you would raise your hands. And I'm really happy that Charles and I, and he's taken me along on some of this informative process of examining his own family background as a dual ethnic union. His mother was French-Canadian from Hugo, and she married a Polish man from Stillwater right after high school. And Charles has taken a look at that, and we'll be talking about that on the 27th of April at the Lakeview, at the Lakeview Library. Shoreview, thank you. The Shoreview Library, which is a wonderful, beautiful place, and we've met there several times already over the last 2 years. Today, I'm going to read the first part of my presentation, simply because I think it's a way for you to get to know me a little bit, and I think you should know a little bit about how I got to where I am with this material. And so I'm going to read you something that I wrote in 1988 after a visit with one of the persons in Red Lake Falls. And thank you for being interested in Pierre Bottineau. He is like a thread through the time that is so critical to what the world has set up as social systems. And Pierre lives through that period from the influences of the early 1800s, before he's born, his influences upon him when he's born, growing up. He lives all the way to almost the end of the century. And today I want to present to you some of those things that flow through an individual. And actually, rivers of thought and ideologies and strong events influence us. And they flow through us from our parents, from our neighbors, from the way city government works, and from the kinds of jobs you can have. These flow through us, these things. The spirit that made those things happen flow through us. And we live all that, and we don't even realize it. Until maybe 100 years later, somebody says, this is what happened. This is a way of saying it. Pierre just lived those things, and I want you to kind of feel some of that, and I'll do my best. But here's the first part, which I'm going to read, and then after that, I will wing it. And like the song that says, the wonderful old French Cajun song, Acadian Song, that deals with us and perhaps the spirit of what Pierre Bottineau was. You know, in this world we have to scramble at times. And we really push people to the side. Sometimes we push ourselves too hard. And then all of a sudden we realize, no, I'm not only that in life, I'm something else as well. I like those songs, those poems that tell us that we are both hunter and shepherd. Acadian song that I told you. On m'a votre chance pour y cueillir. On m'a votre chance pour y cueillir. Je n'ai pas cherché, j'ai cherché des nids. They sent me out in the fields to gather, and instead I hunted for nests. And I stepped on the wing of a meadowlark, and in looking up at me, she said, "What are you doing here, kind sir?" These balancing of our emotions are found also in the way we create social entities. They can do good, and we don't know it. They can do bad, and we don't seem to realize it. Because to change them is very, very hard. I will read this now. It'll take about 5 minutes for this part, maybe 10. I'm going to make a couple of comments where what I observed in the conversation I had in 1988 shook me. And when I got home, I just wrote it the way I heard it. And when I read it to my wife last night, she says, "No, you have to tell the people you're talking to that you assume that they would understand that you would not be in agreement with what was said." So when we get to that part, I'll make a little comment, and that will tell you a lot, too, about who I am, and some of you may cancel your supper with me tonight. That's all right. This part is called How History Lives in Community. I will look into communities today to find Bottineau. Several communities will be mentioned. Here is the first one. On March 25, 1987, Walter Deutschmann called my parents and left a message saying he was sorry he could not come to any of our history meetings, especially the one on Pierre Bottineau. But he did have a book that a governor of Minnesota had given to Bottineau, and he wanted me to have it. I went to Walter's that evening at 7 p.m. During the evening, we visited about Pierre Bottineau. Walter did not know much about Pierre, but he had known Charles Bottineau, a son of Pierre who lived in Red Lake Falls and who frequented the North Side Bar, Walter's parents' place on the north side. Charles would walk his bushy poodle-like dog to the bar, known as the Deutschmann. There he would pick up his pail of beer. Charles would often strike up a conversation with Mr. Deutschmann. Charles told many stories. The one which Walter remembered was about how Charles was born in a canoe on a river in the Northwest. Charles says, persons such as, Walter said, persons such as Charles reviewed and repeated past events to such an extent that their memories could be trusted. Walter described the Bottineau house as a beautiful place, carefully decorated with lovely wood trimming. The banister to go upstairs was also carefully made. Walter's mother, born in 1882, was a friend of the Bottineaus. Walter said that the Sortedal family now live there and how to get in touch with them. Walter was very interested in how Pierre Bottineau came to participate in the settlement of the Northwest. We discussed in that respect Pierre's father and mother and what they would have told him and what he would have heard and seen as he grew up. Pierre was 16 or younger, as Pierre here said, when he began to take some very significant personal initiatives for himself. Walter Walter then that evening gave me a book entitled Vigilante Days and Ways by N.P. Langford. The title page and dedication of the book are missing. On the inside of the first page is found, presented by ex-Governor W.R. Marshall to Pierre Bottineau. Someone has written in pencil, presented to Pierre Bottineau, March 25, 1890, by ex-Governor W.R. Marshall. The book had been loaned at one point to the Minnesota Historical Society. Walter does not remember why or when. When the book came back, there was a small business card that read on one side, Walter Dutchman. On the other side, Eugene Becker, Curator, Picture Department, Minnesota Historical Society. Walter spoke of his days at the University of Minnesota. He actually lived in the 1930s in a dormitory of which one of the wings was dedicated to Pierre Bottineau. Walter studied music for 6 years, specializing in the violin. He became extremely nervous because of his studies, and he returned home to work in the family store. Walter's parents were from Berlin, Germany, and of high German culture. This is where I began to feel strange. His grandfather was a Lutheran minister. His German was beautiful, Walter said. Walter's leg was amputated when he was 9 years old. And from then on, he became what he calls a sensitive observer. Walter was born in 1913. On the playground, he observed how World War I caused animosity between the French and the German people. The French would often make remarks to their German fellow pupils. These remarks would lead to fighting. Once Father Lemire spoke of the French and German languages. He explained how German was a guttural language and French was different. Father Lemire understood, according to Walter, the German people and was trusted by them because he had gone to St. John's, a school favorably disposed to Germany. Father Lemire recited poems in both French and German. Walter has never forgotten how beautiful he thought the French language was at that time. He asked me to read some poems he had on the covers of 2 records he had. He gave me the records that evening to use with my students. For I've always felt bad about the way culture is looked at. Is that some people believe there's such a thing as high culture, and some people feel that they should be falsely humiliated because they've been identified as part of a low culture. I didn't regard Walter as knowing what he was saying. I think what he wanted to say is that he was high class, and so were the Bottineaus, and they were worthy of each other. I don't believe any of that. So today, when I talk to you, I don't see Bottineau as high class. I don't see him as low class. And I don't see any of the people I live with who speak French Canadian as low class or high class. They all have their class. And they've all done things that are unforgettable if you get to know them. The real problem with culture is who chooses what we are supposed to look at when we are supposed to see it. And so I'm really pleased today that we can look at Pierre Bottineau. But here's a few other things from Red Lake Falls, I think, that I can tell you that reflect upon the context of my learning and the context that, to some degree, I think I represent or can represent a little bit, say a few words about it. that are perhaps somewhat true. But it's really very, very hard to figure out where you can hide, and where you can find somebody. I don't think Pierre intentionally hid, except a few times. There's fun things and funny things when you look at Pierre Bottineau's life. It's absolutely amazing. I'll hurry up and get there. History creates many forms of communities, and remember to look for Bottineau within the communities we lived. I'm not interested too much in isolated individuals. I'm interested in the communities they were. This telling of an evening with Walter Deutschmann still reminds me not only of Walter sitting behind the curtain later on. I would see him after he had come back to work in his family store, his parents' store. I can still see him candling eggs that the farmers would take in baskets of 12 dozen, set them down. And those egg cartons were sitting all over the room. And in the back of the room, this was a kind of a back room to the store. And the next door over was the Deutschmann bar. And you would walk in this back door of the store and take your eggs in. And there was Walter sitting with his one leg out like this that was stiff. It was a wooden leg. And you could see him in the back of the curtain putting one egg at a time over the light that would judge the quality of the egg. And my father would set down the 12 dozen cakes of eggs, and they go in with the coupon for flour. I remember these things like I remember when I interviewed Mr. Demerat, who came from this part of the country up north with his family. In about 1880, he went up there. The Bottineaus had already been there for 4 or 5 years. They were fairly well established by then. Nice home. And down below a high bank, if you look from the shore of the Clearwater River up to where the Bottineau house was located in Red Lake Falls, you had about 50 to 60 feet there of bank. And down below ran the Clearwater River. It's a lovely river. It's clear, it's slow, it's cool. And that evening when the Demerats arrived and I asked the son, the oldest son, do you know who took them in the colony? Because we're all called colonies up there. There were a lot of colonies. I'll tell you about some of them. But there was the colony of Red Lake Falls, where the Bottineaus were, like a capital of all the little communities around. I said, how were they received? What did the people do? He said, all I know is that the Bottineaus took them in for the first supper, and it was of sturgeon from the river. The sturgeon, if you stood them up once you caught them, would be from here down to the ground. Pierre, during his entire life, connected people to community, whether it was people from St. Paul back up to Red Lake Falls, from Winnipeg down here. Whether it was the crew of 10 guys who go to Breckenridge. I'm going to pick out just a couple of episodes in a few minutes and tell you about them as if they were typical. But for Bottineau, they happened all the time. I could have come dressed as Pierre Bottineau because in the mid-1980s, after I had been commissioned to tell these stories about Bottineau, I counted one time as best I could for all the contracts I had with the state of North Dakota Historical Society was over 320 talks. People were coming back and they were getting bored of me and I of them, and finally one of them said, well, why don't we go out? Well, I'm glad I had chores at home. I couldn't go out, and we'll be going out tonight anyway. So, Bottineau, you see, Bottineau in Red Lake Falls is about 8 miles from Old Crossing. And Old Crossing is where the Treaty of 1863 was negotiated. Bottineau was was there for that. And he had been up and down that trailway a lot of times over the years. In fact, as a young boy, he almost drowned in the Red Lake River right by Old Crossing, where you cross the river. What a title to have. What a title to have in a place in your community, where on one side you had the wilderness people from off of the prairie. The wilderness people from off of the prairie coming down, crossing that river to St. Paul with the trade goods on the ox carts. 500 pounds per ox cart. And in the heyday of the ox cart trading business, when Antoine Gingras was the main contractor and freighter, oh, I have to tell you about Antoine sometime, and I wish I could do it now. 1,500 carts would leave old St. Joseph, where he was established, from 1840, after they had moved from Pembina, away from the flooding. High plains, closer to the buffalo herds, closer to where you could get up on the high plain from out of the gully, not the gully, but the gorges, and go hunt the buffalo. 1,500 carts on some of those summers would pass over Old Crossing on their way to civilization. And in your minds you say, is there anything else but civilization? And I look at you and I say, I will not say there was low culture, and I will not say there's high culture. And you just keep using that word civilization if you want. But don't forget, there's something else too. The people of the wilderness, and they were known as French as sauvage, people of the wilderness, not savages, but that's what the English people, or those who didn't know much French of any background, would hear that word and they'd say they're calling us savages. No. Sauvage is an honorable term. It shouldn't be used because it's not understood for what it really is. It means the people of wilderness. And if you have prejudice against the people of wilderness, well, then it's going to be hard to find Bottineau. I live 4 miles from Old Crossing. Pierre knew all that area very, very well. He had taken people up to explore the mineral possibilities, the fertile land. And then when Alexander Ramsey wrote his report to the U.S. Commissioner of Indian Affairs, he said, I have passed through from the mouth, or where the beginning of the Red River is, and that's by Breckenridge. Where Breckenridge is today, that is where the Red River begins, and it flows north. And he says, as I have moved north towards Old Crossing, and don't forget, Old Crossing was old already in 1863. It was at that time called Old Crossing, because the ox carts had been crossing the Red Lake River. Don't confuse it with the Red River, that's a little further away in Grand Forks, 40 miles away. The ox carts had been crossing Red Lake River from the Red Lake Reservation today for just about 20-some years before the treaty happened there. So they came to Old Crossing. I live 4 miles from Old Crossing, and there's an Indian statue there, little village of Hewitt. 3 families live there. They're worried the ice might jam up and flood them out. But they're used to that, and they'll be back in a month. Our extended neighborhood ran from Hewitt. We're in the tiny Hewitt store. I ate my first full pint of ice cream. But beyond the 4-mile marathon to Hewitt from our home, where the Treaty of 1863 was negotiated by Alexander Ramsey on the banks of the Red Lake River, we call Old Crossing, there were on the local map villages like Gently, Lambert, half of Crookston, Hewitt, Terrebonne, where my mother was born. My father was born along the Red Lake River in Red Lake Falls. Lambert, Oakley, and further north, Argyll. There were a lot of communities of French-Canadian background, something which Pierre Bottineau had triggered off. It was a community of French people alongside the Walter Deutschmans. We were an ethnically divided community in that sense. The French Canadians, as far as ethnicity were concerned, the things that held them together were such things as common origin, common language, common religion, common food. The work patterns were similar, and they were mostly farming, or else they were people in small stores in the farms that depended on the farming community. Politically, we were for everything and anything that favored farming. We were simply in the 1950s, when I was growing up, a community of second-generation settlers, immigrants from French Canada. When I began taking courses in school in French, there was nothing written that we could study that came from French Canada. And for many years, as I studied French, I tried to figure out, where does "je" come from? Now, there were words that I never saw on the page and I never heard the teacher say. And you know, even to this day, I still discover the origins of words of which I know the meaning so well. But in the written language of French, I have never encountered them, and even to this day, I will still find some. But I have to read literature from the 16th and 17th centuries to discover that. Now, am I to call some of the greatest writers that we have ever recognized as inferior because they wrote like my parents spoke? And so I would ask, where does our beginning begin? Because we're on the map here, but I don't see that we're on what we call the canon in the academic system. Well, I don't want to belabor that today, but it was a bit of a struggle for me to find myself in academia. So the first thing I did once I got out of graduate school, I wrote a history of the parish and community of Gently, Minnesota. The bishop wrote to me at that time, and he said, my gosh, the people are really happy here that they kind of know more about where they're from. I once told my students I was doing a Métis course, and we call that Michif. We call that Michif. It's Métis in Canada, but in North Dakota, where resides the largest population of what we would call mixed blood or half-breeds. In Canada, they're called Métis. And when you use the word Métis, you are saying, like, I am Canadien. I'm of old stock Canadian. And in the United States, then, the largest concentration of Métis, which was pronounced earlier in time as Michif, that location is in North Dakota. I'd love to take you on a trip there sometime. I was just there a couple of weeks ago to the center of the Michif community, but it's no longer called Michif community. It's a Chippewa reservation in which there's a lot of culture called the Michif culture. The food, the origin of the fathers is the same as among the French Canadians where they live. Now, I once told a group of students who were of Michif and Lakota background. It was in one of my last courses, and I said to them, they were always trying to find themselves along with the readings we would do. I mean, who am I? And they would always go back to the past and say, well, grandparents did this, and I remember such and such. And it was all out in the countryside where they had grown up. I got tired of the seeking and probing, and yet they would never really tell me what their grandparents had told them, what they had learned. They didn't seem connected. And they'd use all these terms that were qualifiers for the things we are in a civilized society. Like we would call them colonized. They went to school in my language because theirs was not of such a quality or of such a standing that you would be really educated if you went to school in their language. I knew they had all lost their language. Many of you know what that means, to lose a language. None of them could speak anything of their languages. And so when I looked at them and I said, "You're not civilized," they were shocked. They had been told that before. And they wanted me to explain what I meant. And I said, "You are from another cultural organization whereby people lived socially, progressed, and survived a lot longer than, or just as long as, any group calling itself civilized has lived." I spoke quickly that day because one of the big fellows in the second row, right in the middle, when I said, "You're not civilized," slapped the other one on the side and he said, "I told you how they feel." I said, "I'll tell you what I'm thinking. You go back home now, and with your elders, you ask them what they called the organization, the social organization in which they, and you tell me back here and give me an affidavit that it was true that you heard it if they used the word civilization." Well, they didn't. And 3 readings later in the following assignments, they began to see some Indian words for what it means to live, or what it meant to live in an organized society. Don't forget the power of the words. If you control the words, you control the agenda of the next meeting. So today we have to look at a little bit of the agenda. When you say, Pierre, that Pierre Bottineau spoke many languages, there's a kind of something that emerges, and we'll get to that, because of that exposure to some things that you'll say, "My God, maybe that's what he's hiding." But just let me say this before I forget. During the Lakota conflict, you remember that in history and you've heard about it, of 1860s, it was just sort of in its intense moments in 63 when Ramsey negotiated the treaty at Old Crossing. He was blaming some of the Chippewa people who were at the treaty, for whom the treaty, or with whom the treaty was being made, as having misbehaved. And they should be careful about how much they would ask for because they had debt for having misbehaved the previous summer. And then I think of people like Pierre. Ramsey had an interpreter, And I thought of the communities as I was preparing again for today. I thought of the many communities where Bottineau had been. And I had heard stories about Martha when Pierre was gone. In the early days of Red Lake Falls, and the Indian people, would go from Red Lake over to their Chippewa relatives over in Belcourt, central northern North Dakota, where the Chippewa reservation is there. There's also the reservation in Red Lake. They would travel that space, and they would often stop off in Red Lake Falls, and they'd go to the Bottineau home. And they'd just walk right through, according to the stories. They'd come in, walk right through, and take what they needed to eat, and Martha would be quite alarmed, didn't know what it would lead to. And Pierre would always say, "Don't worry about it. They know I'm here. They know this is where I live. And if we have something, it has to go. If they're hungry, that's the way it would go." But if you look at the communities that were really hurt, physically hurt, through violent actions during that conflict, you'll say, I don't know what it's due to. There's a bit of a mystery when you do people's stories. But Osseo was never touched. And they came by. Pierre wasn't there at the time. And some people in Osseo who like to make legends say, it's because they know Pierre lives there. Well, I'm glad we haven't gone so far in making our legends that we all have Pierre Bottineau winter caps in our closets. Because you know, with the people who look at Bottineau, and they would write about him and who he was, some called him the Kit Carson of the West, some the Daniel Boone, some the, who else? There was a story about, was it Daniel Boone, that was televised when we were kids? And a lot of this stuff that we have that comes to us from our heroes and heroines comes from the 50s. Do you know when Disney had a television program? You know, we were just buying televisions ourselves. I don't know, you people probably all had them for many years, but we were just buying television and stories up there. And I think one of the main stories was about one of these characters. You must remember that. There was a Disney show, and I think it was Singing on the Old Frontier, boom, ba-da-dum, boom, boom. It had its theme song, and the guy wore this coonskin cap. Do you know that when that program was going and it was on television, that Disney sold 5,000 coonskin caps every day? And maybe it went on for 3 years. I should have brought, I was sorry, I was halfway here, and I said, darn, I forgot to bring my Bottineau cap. There's no way we would have sold 5,000 of those in any period of time. And I'm really glad because we didn't make that kind of a hero. He was not a Kit Carson. He was not a Daniel Boone. There were a few other ones in there too. And I think one of the elements in all of that is that he wasn't purely an American hero. We've got that Canadian element up there floating around. And if you know, when script was given out, subsequent to the treaties, you had to be what was called in the United States to get script after the treaties. You had to be qualifiable as a half-breed or a mixed blood. And I don't know how many documents I've looked at that are the records of deeds for land holdings. And whenever it was somebody who had filed for claim after the treaty lands, you could only get it under these conditions: that you be mixed blood, half-breed, and that you be related to somebody who was part of the treaty process. In other words, in our area, Chippewa. If you were full-blood, you had to choose for the reservation, or just abandon the whole outfit of being sustained in some society or some community. But if you could claim you were half-breed or Chippewa, then you could decide where you wanted to go, because you were, and this is in the deed, a civilized person. The others were not. They were people of the wilderness. In French, we'd say sauvage. Don't use those terms. They're out of date. And people, you've got to lecture for half an hour for somebody to get that. It hurts people in the meanwhile, so we've just got to abandon that word. And so, I don't know where the point was, but the Bottineau's got a lot of land eventually. And the point here is that nowhere in any of those documents that are U.S. documents would you ever find the word Métis. You'll find half-breed or mixed blood. But if you use that word Métis in an official document, then it's, who the hell are you talking about here? Are you talking about foreigners who don't deserve to be in this country? That's what it was. Nobody wanted to be called identified as a Métis if you were living in the U.S. and you were benefiting from a community that was in the U.S. I remember when I did oral interviews in the 1980s in French on the Turtle Mountains. There were a lot of French-speaking people on the Turtle Mountains. Michif people, Métis in Canada. Some of them would say, I remember Matilda Poitras, who's gone now, she said to me after we had visited for many summers or two, she said to me, don't tell people while I'm living that I was really of Canadian background. I'm Canadian. They didn't want to lose their stuff, whatever it was. Cheese on Friday, they've given out. Let's take a look now at a few events. And this is where I'm going to sort of ad-lib, and I'll go for a while yet if you don't. And the things we'll never know about somebody as part of the truth. Do you follow that? Well, if not, here's an example. Charles Bottineau, Pierre's father, was born in Berthier-en-Haut in Quebec. Very close to that area where there were many, many voyagers that were recruited. Not far from Pierre and all of that. I don't know what to think about the Huguenot stuff because I'm still leaving room for Huguenots who can do what you said they did. They left the 13 colonies after their big disappointment in 76 of Britain no longer controlling, and they went up into Canada and they became loyalists and all of that. There is the Huguenot theory. But there's also the theory of we don't know how to deal with that because the Huguenots weren't allowed into Canada when it was under French control. And but then there's always somebody who says, oh yeah, but so-and-so made it. So let's just say that that's one of those things. Anyway, Charles was born in Berthier-en-Haut. In the same year, he is recruited, or he decides to go. It's both. He's recruited and he decides to go to the west to enter into the fur trade. He is one of a whole brigade of young trade people. They'll be voyageurs at first, and then after that they'll get into the trade because maybe they'll stay out in the community where they go in their destination in the fur trade. And they'll get more experience, and eventually they'll rise in the business to be something or other beyond somebody who paddled the canoe to get nice back and forth. This little thing is like my puppy. I have to keep hitting it down. And so he's one of 22 fellows that get recruited from the same parish. And that interests me. For many ways. I mean, there's the companies that go in, and you get 22 guys to form a brigade, and you're going to send them way out. Now, can you hear me fairly well there now, rather than having echoes coming from the bottom of the table? It's okay. They send them out west of where Winnipeg is today, to the Assiniboine area. And there's no big, violin music on a Saturday night over there. And they function together for at least 2 years and maybe 4. Charles is with that group. And they function and they respect the authority of the Northwest Fur Company. And, we're about 18, if Pierre's born in 17, we're with his dad. We are around the year 1795 when he was out there. And so about 1800, some Chippewa people start to gather around Pembina. And that's where his mother eventually gravitates towards Pembina. That's to be the wife of Charles. Charles, however, after his contract is finished with the Northwest Fur Company, he stays on out in the country. But he no longer works for the Northwest Company. He actually takes on the job of hunting buffalo for the Red River Colony, which is to be St. Boniface and Winnipeg. So it's a growing community. And he takes on now the job of being a buffalo hunter for them. Now, this is one place where we're going to find him in terms of his loyalties and his thought about what is a community and what do you do for people in that community. The situation is complex because the people who were running the Red River Colony, except for the little piece there of St. Boniface, were retired people from the Hudson Bay Company who didn't want to go back, let's say, to Montreal, who decided to stay where they had spent their career. And so there was a society coming up there, but it was a society very loyal to the Hudson Bay Company. Now, in 1805, I think it is, Selkirk, whom Pierre mentioned, Lord Selkirk, from Scotland, approaches the Hudson Bay Company, which is an old company in that area. It was established in 1670s. So it's already been going for 100 years, it's been trading with the native peoples up there. And now this younger company, the Northwest Company, comes from Montreal, not from the north part of the country, the Hudson Bay, and then down. It has to bring in its merchandise in the summer when it's all thawed out up there with ships. The Hudson Bay would bring in its company, and the native peoples would travel up. Take them all summer to get their trade goods back and forth. When the Northwest Company gets formed, it's formed by Scottish people, rich people in Montreal, who settled into Montreal after the fall of the French Empire in North America. And that empire fell in 1776. So by the 1790s, when the Northwest Company, fur trading company, is formed, there are Scottish people living in Montreal who have come there because they've got money and they're going to invest, and they've got some security because they're investing in the British Empire, or in the territory controlled by the British Empire. So, it's kind of contradictory. So is the Hudson Bay Company British outfit. But these other folks are going to give some competition to some cousins. And what they do is they send canoes loaded with merchandise from Montreal out to the west. And that makes them little delivery boys. You want a pizza? You don't have to come and get it, just call in. And that was like service, I'll tell you, compared to spending the summer walking up to the Hudson Bay. Well, that put a real binding on the business of the Hudson Bay. And everybody who was paddling those canoes was a French Canadian. If somebody who owned the outfit, they're sitting in the middle of the canoe, looking around, taking pictures. I'm sorry, well, anyway, with their eyes. And the other guys are paddling like mad, and you know all about that, don't you? Oh, you should. And so Charles is one of those fellows. And what is interesting now, when he goes to hunt buffalo for the colony of Red River, he's hunting buffalo now for a competitor of the old company he just finished working for. Well, put that one on whatever scoreboard you got for community service. You say, not loyal to his employer? The father of Pierre? What is this about? Well, I'll tell you what it's about, I think. Remember how much what we hear and what we see can influence us or anybody else? The people who had come from Scotland that Lord Selkirk had taken over, they were to protect the Hudson Bay interests down in the area where the Northwest Company people had moved in. To get their goods over to Grand Portage, they had to go up in an area, get into the rivers, take the rivers, continue, and they were in Hudson Bay territory, where these Scottish people, Yorkneys, had come in, and they were to defend and defend the business of the Hudson Bay Company. And so they'd, grab a canoe every now and then when they could, merchandise. And the Northwest guys got tired of that. And in 1816, they said, look, you do that to us, let's have a scrimmage. And it was going to be with rifles. They said, all right, we'll show up. And the Métis met them there with their rifles and their ponies. And there was no way. There was no way. Look, I'm not for rifles and guns, and even Tim is not for ponies anymore after being thrown in service of the country, almost into a coma by a horse. But anyway, this is the truth. This is the truth. You couldn't beat the Métis in a fight. You couldn't. Don't even think about it. Because they were hunting all the time with rifles that were the best you could get at the time. And with the fastest and best ponies you could get. Because they were at the heart of a center of something that had been happening for a long time. Trade with the French had given them wonderful ammunition to hunt and be part of the business of the fur trade. They had inherited that. That was part of the relationship. You come in the trade store and you'll trade. We'll give you the traps in the fall. You come in the spring, give us what you harvested, and we'll give you some more traps. It'll all be paid. The ponies had come up from the south through traders. Charles Bottineau, the father of Pierre, was a horse trader, and that's what he was doing by Grand Forks. Or later on, he established some trading business for the amount of time that he had in his life. He passed away in 24, was buried in East Grand Forks, but he was a horse trader. And you could not beat the Métis because they had access to the best equipment you could possibly get. I'm sure those guys would kill a prairie dog, from here to the door over there with the rifles. You couldn't beat them. You just forget it. And so they swept in a place called, what do you call that? White Oaks or something like that? What is it? Seven Oaks, thank you. So they came in there, and bang, bang, it was all over, and people were dead, and the Métis rode off, and that evening the poet of the Métis people, who was kind of like a chronicler of history, he wrote this song in French to chronicleize what had happened. And he said in French, do you want to hear the truth of the whole matter? This Governor Semple has brought in people from Scotland, and they're taking away our land, and actually, the background to it all was that the first 2 years these Scottish people had come in, they went and settled in Pembina because that's the only place the Métis could really feed them from buffalo they could go and harvest. The Métis people were saying, these were Northwest Fur Trading Company people, we've fed them now for 2 years, and as soon as they think they can do it on their own, they say, we can't hunt buffalo anymore because they need them. And that's what they were trying to do, is to say, look, you can't hunt buffalo around here anymore. So the clash had come to that. And Bottineau was in that. And does he choose to, which side does he take? Bottineau's father. And he takes the side where he's going to hunt buffalo for the city and abandons loyalty to the old company. Well, let me tell you a little bit about those Yorkney people. Oh, I got to sing a little bit in French here. Almost the Mitch's anthem was, voulez-vous écouter chanter une chanson de vérité? Le 19 de juin, les bandes de bois brûlés sont arrivés comme de braves guerriers. Oh, they had everything, poets and singers, getting enthusiastic about it all. But what did they not hear that maybe Bottineau heard? You know how bad those Yorkney people had it before Lord Selkirk offered them the opportunity to come to Red River? Do you know how bad they had it? It is not impossible that one of them told Charles, we have been expelled from the territory on which our ancestors had lived for generations and generations. And we were shepherds, small sheep herders, and we lost all our ground to big farming people that have taken over, who are wealthy and who bought our stuff. And we were removed. And we have lived now on the shores of lakes and seaside. So long that we have to either choose between suffering, starving, or leaving. Some of them had gone so far as to pierce the main veins on their horses that they had yet, and drink the blood without the horse dying, so that they could survive another day, another week. That's what Charles could have heard. Charles was one of the best hunters. He must have been really good, because in spite of what you would call misbehaving, I don't know what you can call that, I just can't find the word right now, but in spite of her conduct, that's odd. Why would he betray the old company and go for these fellows, for newcomers? He did. It wasn't too long after Pierre was born. See, Pierre was born in 1817. His father passed away in 1824. At a young age then, his mother moved them away from where they were in the wilderness on the prairie up to the new settlement of Red River. And there, Bottineau met a fellow who was a message carrier for the Hudson Bay Company. I think it was Hudson Bay Company. Must have been. The Hudson Bay Company, just owned all the Red River drainage basin. It's huge. Went down to Fort Fargo, is 60 miles on each side of the Red River, boom, all the way up to the Hudson Bay. Yeah, that land. So they had a lot of messages to start. In that time, in the 1820s, 30s, life became internationally just a race of mobility. Just one statistic from that period of time, from the 1840s, let's say. Well, there's a 100-year period where over 47 million people come to the United States as immigrants. That mobility started in the 1840s and the 1850s. One of the ways that Pierre really acquired a lot of information about how to get around in a country that had no roads and no pathways was that in the early 1830s, he came down to Fort Snelling as a message carrier for the Hudson Bay Company. And he learned from an older fellow who had come along with him the best pathways. And he discovered other pathways. And he never went astray. He never went astray. But urgency was always there at this time. If it wasn't the telegraph that was going to set up in Breckenridge as the center of the world so that it could broadcast up north, and we were going to be in touch with Russia through the telegraph, and that people were hurrying up to claim land in this part of the country and that part of the country, it was something else. But everybody was moving who could move. And Bottineau was able to help people move around. So it wasn't too long, I believe it was Christmas or something like that, in about 1836. And he's living up in Red River, and I think it was a couple of days they left, I believe, right after Christmas. Everybody wants to go someplace at Christmas. They come, and these two fellows come, three fellows, and one of them has been around a little bit. It seems like he might be from the United States. He wants to get down in this area where it's not so cold, it's not so much snow and so forth. The other one is from Poland because of the Polish Revolution and worker problems and issues there as workers emerged in society, and upheavals, social upheavals being stomped down. This Polish fellow ends up in Red River in Christmas time or so. He wants to get out. He comes, one of three guys, will you take us? One of the elements with Pierre that's really astounding is that he would accommodate every darn thing that seems to have come along. So he says, yeah, I'll take you down. And so they take off. And I think the only time that I've ever noticed that Pierre Bottineau lost anybody, or anybody incurred the worst of, the fate that you can have on a trip, in other words, die, happened at this time. And the reason that's given by the one fellow who wrote it up, he says, the Polander refused to wear snowshoes. And when it came dusk, a storm came on, and Pierre would always say, I'll meet you over that bush over there, a mile or so away. And that's where we'll go. And he would take off and he'd go hunting for something to have at the camp that night. So he goes, and the Polander and a couple other guys, they're sort of along. The one fellow who couldn't, the storm comes up, and one fellow who couldn't manage his snowshoes, he gets lost, and they find him frozen to death in the snowbank the next day. That's the only person out of all the hundreds of people Bottineau guided, there was not the highest praise for that man. It was unbelievable. When Isaac Stevens wanted to, going to be leaving from here, when he was commissioned to do a big expedition out into the Dakotas, and he was going to go all the way to the Pacific, but Bottineau was the one he needed to take him up to Yellowstone. The guys had territories. Bottineau could go into Montana and around, but he didn't go Manitoba to some degree, North Dakota, Minnesota, and that was it. Isaac Stevens wrote to Washington and said, who do you recommend as my best guide? And the word came back, Bottineau. You cannot get a better guide than Bottineau. It was amazing the reputation the man had. He was steadfast, and I never heard of anybody saying, you can't trust the guy. Father frequented the Indian people, and so marrying a Chippewa woman that became Pierre's mother was totally ordinary. They were at ease with difference. And that difference also could explain why he wasn't simply a French Canadian. It's another urgency. And it's all precipitated by a lot of local things and then international stuff that people hear about. In Minneapolis and St. Paul, we're becoming extremely international. Can you imagine Minneapolis being the capital of the flour milling industry of the world? Oh, Pierre Bottineau lived next to all of that happening. And he himself was an entrepreneur. Real estate guy, sold lots galore there in Old St. Anthony. Did other things. But his money, and this is where at some point you've got to make some distinctions on how money is used. The 19th century determines to a great degree what people will do with money. You take money and let it circulate in your community. 2 weeks ago when I was at a conference in Belcourt, in the heart of the Chippewa Reservation there, the main speaker, and actually then the chair of the council there on that reservation, said, we have to get it so that the dollar will circulate in our community. You cannot have it that it come here and then it ends up in some place in the world where you don't know where it is and you don't know how you can benefit from it. Those issues of what would happen to capital, what would happen to money, began in the 19th century. Pierre, one might say, and I was talking to Indian scholar who was just an outstanding scholar. Champagne was his name, Duane Champagne. And he and I talked after the conference in Belcourt the other day. And he's the one who introduced me to this matter of money. He said, money, he said, is interesting. But he said, look at our people and what they have just said here. Duane is a member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa. He said, look at what they've said. They said, let's spend our money on each other as much as we can. The closest thing that I can see to Bottineau in that sense of being a community member would be like when he'd almost throw his money away. You've heard those stories about, he had Nicollet Island for a little while and bingo was sold and they went on a party. At least his friends where the money was going. But there's another kind of community where you don't know where the money goes and you never see it again. And that's a different kind of community. I don't know what Bottineau was selling. It's foolish, it's nuts, and it's kind of those gangster stories that you know, to sort of create some sort of sensationalism about somebody. But I don't know where it was. It was up north there after he built his luxurious house, probably so. Probably some Red Lake County person half insane about the glory of Bottineau and wanting to think that they know him intimately or whatever it was. But anyway, Bottineau bought cigars and handed them out to all the men at the housewarming party and then gave each one a $10 bill so they could light the cigar. What kind of fascinating nonsense is all of that? But anyway, what it does capture is the guy had a good spirit and he tried to share what he had. Let's move on to the last of the episodes and then some other tailors, on things. You know what really is a fascinating thing is that Breckenridge expedition that he took. In 1852, when everybody thought that Breckenridge would be the center of the world, they were going to put a big telegraph line up there, and that land was going to be opening up real soon, the Hudson Bay had said they were going to sell their holdings, and you had 10 years to decide to get it, and the Americans from St. Paul were pushing. Water flows from the Red River, that should be ours, we know that. Oh, I mean, they spoke more eloquently than I about that issue, that old land that the Hudson Bay had controlled for 150 years should now go into the U.S. hands. And we fought for that. By golly, we fought for that and lobbied for it, and all kinds of interesting people boogied up there into areas, and they especially negotiated with the Métis people, because the Métis people were the majority of the population. And you could say, whichever sway the Métis take is the way it will go, because they'll protect the interests, they'll fight for it all. The Fenians got into it, and they were doing all kinds of destructive things to hurt the British Empire's effort to grab that Hudson Bay land, and purchase. Anyway, this is what's all going on, is that intense moving. So these guys come Christmas Day again, or the day after Christmas, down here where Bottinau's living, but he's come on. Over there he's in Osseo, and they come and they get him and say, we gotta go and set a claim in Breckenridge before anybody else does, and the weather's so bad, we're sure nobody else is gonna get up there, and we gotta go tomorrow. Well, Bottineau says, give me 5 days. I gotta put together, the teamsters, the guys who drive the wagons. We've got to have good sleds. And he says, I got to get oats for the animals. I got to pack this up. And he says, I got to make things for you guys to survive. So 10 guys take off. One's a surveyor, 2 are investors, 3 are going to buy. Spend their last dollar on investing and making a claim in Breckenridge. I'm going to jump right away to the end of the story, but I'll come back to the middle because the middle is fun. It's nothing. They get absolutely nothing out of it. It comes to nothing. 2 of them just walk off. The weather's so bad, they just walk off in a storm and you never see them again. I don't know, I think Bottineau went out and found them or something. And the guy, he never just let anybody go. Nobody was lost on that one, except a couple of guys went insane. So they go out there and they're surveying, it's nuts. But getting out there, I remember one time I was giving one of these talks, and we had a group of people who would sing in between some of the comments, and if you people, you'd make these meetings a lot more interesting if some of you would start singing, stand up and sing every once in a while. But anyway, I didn't know that in the group there was in the visitors group, we were at Buffalo River, and in the group there was somebody from National Geographic. And when I started to say that expedition to Breckenridge was so hard on the men and the animals, that as the oxen moved through the snow, and that one was in April. I don't know what the wagon in April. Anyway, there was a crust on the snow that had formed. And the snow was about a foot deep, except where there were drifts. And as they walked, they started to make severe cuts on their legs. And the teamsters, along with Bottineau, were trying to That's a bad part, you wouldn't want to hear it anyway. They wrapped those legs so that those could keep walking. It was stuff like that all the time. Well, here's the big one. I got to tell you about this one. Pierre Bottineau. I'll tell you, in life, there's a few things that you can say you got going for you. If you've got conviction, and you've got the stamina to keep the motor going. It seemed like Bottineau had conviction. And he must have had a tremendous ability to sustain all kinds of things. On one of those expeditions, oh yeah, well, this is where the Polander got lost. The weather got so bad, they went 10 days without any food. And then they did the deplorable, you know. It must have been sad. I don't think he would want to tell you how he got the meal that sustained them. But Bottineau always had a dog with him. I won't tell you what happened to the dog after 10 days of no food. And they were good hunters, but sometimes they just couldn't find it. Well, this is what happened. Somewhere between St. Cloud and Breckenridge, a storm came up, and Bottineau had told them, look, there's a storm coming, and you guys go down by the bank of the river, which is maybe half a mile away, and you get down there, and you stay sheltered, and I'm going to hunt for something. Well, when he did get something, he cut a piece of the carcass off of it and carried it to the camp. And when he got to the camp, the men had gotten to the spot all right, but their clothing was soaked. They were soaked to the skin. And the temperatures were going down for the night. Now you know what that means. They would have all died of hypothermia. This is what Bottineau does. He says, all right, all you guys, here's the big blanket I took. You get into that. But before you get in, take off the clothes. I'll make a fire, I'll dry them off, and you get in there. You got them all under that big blanket that he had made. Before he had made it, somebody made it. And then they had buffalo robes. They put the buffalo robes down underneath, put the blanket on top, and some more buffalo robes. And it wasn't big enough for all of them if they laid down on their backs, so they would lay down on their sides. This part is mine now. You get at least one joke, okay? So they're all on their sides. And somebody raised the hand, you know. Well, what happened if somebody turned? I said, they all turned at the same time. When they wake up in the morning, their clothes are dry, or he gets them up, they all get into dry clothes. Take them on. He had that kind of ability. He was comfortable with the Indian people. He spoke the languages. He did not like the people we called the Sioux. And that must be because they clashed with the Métis. Bottineau really went along with the Métis. At one point, he was very much in favor of what Antoine Gingras had, the big freighting guy, you know, with the ox carts. Antoine Gingras absolutely wanted a treaty so that he could send his ox carts up and down the trail without being stopped by the Chippewa, who said, you're crossing our land now, please give us something for it, you know. He wanted that to stop. And Bottineau was for the treaties. And so some people have written to me after they've heard me talk, or before they heard me talk, or see some of the stuff we've written, and they say, I don't know why you're in favor of Bottineau, what he did. He wanted that treaty up there at Oak Crossing, and it wasn't favorable to the Indian people. Why are you for that? Don't you understand? Yeah, but my personal understandings of things are, you know, are one thing. But it's clear Bottineau's figured were afraid that the Indian people would be assimilated. And that seems to have been true until about some other things that we began to notice in the 1890s. John B. Bottineau, Pierre Bottineau's son, is the son of Geneviève Larence from Red River, and John B. Bottineau. John B. became the lawyer for the Turtle Mountain Chippewa and defended them that they deserved land claims and so on, and more land. The treaty gave them such a small amount of land at some point. John B. Bottineau defended them. But it wasn't, but he also was with the notion that Indian people would be assimilated and they better get the best deal possible because they're going. It wasn't until about 1890 that John B. Bottineau's daughter, which would be a niece to Pierre, she became a lawyer herself. Her name was Marie Bottineau Baldwin. And we and Baldwins that were related to her, and she came to Red Lake Falls to visit with them. And this would be in the 1920s or so. She became a lawyer, one of the first women lawyers, and probably the first Native American woman lawyer in the country. She began to turn the sentiment around that Indian people had lost so much, we'd have to try to save something from out of that experience of the people of the wilderness. Civilization comes from a couple of words, but the first word means city. Came to Minnesota from the east, they wanted to establish the city. Métis people never lived quite that way. They would perpetuate a more detailed relationship to the geography in which they lived. But since they also associated with the people of the city, the order that come from the city, it's a very different order than when you are independent and separate from the city. And those people we call Métis lived on the border all the time of civilization and the life of the wilderness, which was not a wild life. It was a life that was determined by their relationship with the geography. The animals, the woods, and so on and so forth. That made them a different people, but not one higher or lower culture, simply different. So I get back to that. There were some who believed civilization was the order that you better take, even if you didn't agree with all the laws and mocked them at some point, you still were better off under the umbrella of civilization. They didn't know quite how you would organize differently. And Antoine Gingras, who at one point, he was a Métis, you see, but he's so wealthy, what do you do with the man? Harper's Magazine, 1859, went to Pembina where he was living. And they thought, people are really quite different in different areas. What's distinctive about some of these people who live up in this area? And they asked Mr. Gingras, they said, you've got quite a business. We see that. And Mr. Gingras, could you tell us just exactly how wealthy you are? Well, it's just about like in those days, it's none of your business. And he says, I'll tell you how wealthy I am. He says, if they got rid of Fort Garry in Winnipeg, he says, I'd buy the rest. Well, he wasn't exaggerating, but he was wealthy as all get out. Now, you can say, was he a capitalist? I don't know. He stingily shared the money with the rest of the community. Some people maintain that there was sort of an attachment to the wilderness, a camaraderie, a friendship, a family, kinship is one of the key communities of the Métis ethnicity. Kinship. They'd always moved from the east, but when they came to Red River, they realized, look, this is a land issue, and if we don't get our land, we ain't going to have nothing very long. The moving and the moving and the moving to stay on the edge of civilization was no longer seen as a reality. You needed it as part of your identity. And that's what America was becoming, a land-holding society as much as possible. When you look at the deeds then, and I was going to take one here, and I said, oh my God, if I take one and I read from it, every time script is given to a half-breed or a mixed blood, it goes in there in view of the stipulations of this Homestead Act and in view of the fact that so-and-so has proven to be mixed blood and of a civilized nature. They will accord 160 acres of that person's choosing, as long as it's within the treaty boundaries for that particular treaty. All the others are considered not civilized. And don't take that as something to explore. What does it mean to not be civilized? You all got cabins on the lake where you can be uncivilized for a weekend once in a while? You want to get away from the city? Well, I'm kind of joking and lighthearted there, but you feel a little bit the tension. Being of the wilderness was being away from the city, and it meant more local, immediate control. But as the world evolved and got more global in its movement, and this didn't happen yesterday, it happened in the 19th century, like I said, people became more and more concerned about the orders under which we could function successfully. And civilization took on quite a force. But examine the life of the alternative. And remember this, in Minnesota, the Treaty of 1863, one of the last ones, not the last one, but one of the last ones, in 40 years, from the 20s to the 90s, well, it's 70 years, Minnesota went from a civilization of the wilderness, where the air and the water and the soil had a very different relationship to the human beings. In Minnesota, in 70 years, went from a wilderness culture to a culture of civilization. Don't be forgetting about what it meant to be of a wilderness. Because here are some of the words we're now taking back from the treaty. By the way, the transcription of the Treaty of 1863 is wonderful. You've got most of, and maybe all of, what Ramsey said to the Indian chiefs and what the Indian chiefs said back in the negotiation. You're not going to get a high price for your land because you say, we believe that the land is sacred and nobody should own it. Look, Ramsey has heard that now several times already. He's a negotiator for the U.S. government. Tell him some more, okay? He's heard that one. He knows, he looks at you in the face and he's saying, thanks. Oh, they're just pulling me off because they want a little more money than I'm offering. And I'll show you. I'm going to give you less. Oh, you didn't have any choice. So don't glorify the fact that this was a big, significant debate. It was significant, but we didn't buy it from the Creator. Basically, that's the argument. And by then, the Homestead Act has come in 1862. Jefferson's policy was that there's nothing that can make you happier than to own some land. And that was the reasoning of our civilization. It's based on property. And until very recently, we used to think the air was, part of the Creator's. And you couldn't at least sue anybody in regards to the air. But let me breathe bad air for a year in my company, that puts me to weld in a corner, and I breathe all the gas and I get bad lungs, I'll sue you because of bad air. So even that now has become a domain to where humans have it under control. But there was a time in the life of the wilderness where there was a different relationship to the world. And now we begin to see, and a lot of people have seen that in the past, don't want to be too arrogant about wilderness or about civilization. When some of our ancestors claimed that they were married according to the way in the country, and then 2 years later the priest would come by and he'd say, oh yeah, we were Catholics, we're for that, bless us. This was called mariage à la façon du pays, and that was meant by this is a wilderness marriage. We don't have access to big fancy churches and bishops and priests and all that. We're just living out here. And that was the counterbalance. And then I want to read to you now a couple of other things which are going to send you home with all kinds of thoughts. In his report to William P. Doe, Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Washington, D.C., Alexander made the following statement at the very end of his report. I omitted to mention in this proper place place, in its proper place, that after the treaty was signed, a written request was prepared by the chiefs of Pembina that the sum of $25,000 be appropriated for the Pembina half-breeds. These were Métis people who could not, he calls them half-breeds here, he will never mention the word Métis. He says half-breeds, in intention to appeal that they be given a little money, because as Métis they weren't going to be given anything. The Pembina half-breeds, that the sum of $25,000 be appropriated for the Pembina half-breeds who had not succeeded in engrafting on the treaty the provisions for their benefit, which they had desired, and that of this $5,000 be granted to Pierre Bottineau as a token of their esteem and in return for the obligations which he had placed them under by past services. All these people were getting committed because of little sliding that they would make for traps, guarding, and all of a sudden they got to pay up. And they're selling all their land, which they thought they couldn't even sell. At some point they say, no, it's not for sale, I can't sell that. Well, they have to give in too. I once asked my students, go home and find out if there's a word for selling land. I still want to go to Red Lake and work with the elders to see if they know there's a word for selling land in Ojibway. You know, you have a different relationship to it. I'm not saying which is one of the best, but I'm here to put on the table some things for your thoughts. So Bottineau gets 5,000 acres from that. And I have something here. Here's a quote from Charles Bottineau. Oh yeah, Charles Boat Crossing. Somebody else had convened the people from Red Lake to come over. And this is what is in the transcriptions of the treaty. And they don't say it's Charles Bottineau. They simply say the messenger who was in charge of bringing to furnish subsistence for the Pembina Indians on their way to the treaty ground, gave as his excuse for bringing such a large number of uninvited guests, now he's talking about the Métis from Pembina, that the Pembina Indians are completely under the control of their half-breed relatives and could not have been induced to come unless accompanied by the latter. So Charles Bottineau, the brother to Pierre, is saying, I brought so many Métis people who were not invited. Alexander Ramsay once said, if only those of you who were invited to this treaty had come, there'd be about 100 people here, and that would be doable. I've got meat, I brought cattle that we can kill for 100 people. I brought enough tobacco so that you can practice your religion. Everything he says that he has, he says he did it for them. But having this many people there, about 1,500 total, it turns out to be 1,200, I guess. He says, I never had, you guys weren't invited. But the messenger then, Charles Bottineau, says, hey, look, come on, this is the reality. Up in Pembina, the half-breeds, Métis, are far in the majority. And if it hadn't been for them relating to these Chippewa people over all these years, the Chippewa would now be absorbed into something else. Because these fellows had fought for them. They're the warriors. In this group from Pembina, is the brother to Pierre's mother, who was living with Pierre and who lived in Osseo with Pierre by a family. Her brother is called Red Bear, and he moved from the Rainy River area there where the Chippewa were. Most of them were on Red Lake, but they were scattered. It was before the treaty. They had moved over from Rainy River, where a Dixon Gab, that's Pierre Bottineau's mother, where she had lived. She moved east then, and that's where, after her husband took off to go back to Montreal after he was finished with his contracts, he was a big shot in the treaty, in the Northwest Fur Company. When he left, she moved over then to Pembina, and that's where she met Charles Bottineau. Okay, well, her brother also moved in, and his name is, in English, Red Bear. I will finish with this particular present piece of drama. It comes from the Cheeseborough family. They didn't write it up this way. But the Cheeseborough family was related to the Bottineaus, and they did an extensive genealogy. And so at one point, when they say Pierre Bottineau was at the treaty and he was an interpreter at the Treaty of 1863, Pierre Bottineau was an interpreter for the Pembina tribe. Ramsay got very impatient at the end. He had come in on the 21st of September. There had been early frosts that had killed the grass. The horses of the army that he had taken with him were not getting all the grass they needed. And it was getting colder. And Ramsay wanted to get back to St. Paul. So on the 2nd, I believe, of October, he told, let's say, and this is where I'm now working on just making something out of what the Cheeseborough people said, because they considered Pierre Bottineau a big hero of civilization, the one that would cause civilization to be accommodated and come in. So it's the night before the chiefs have been asked to sign the next morning. And Ramsay's not sure they'll sign sufficiently in number. And so he says to Pierre and the other interpreters, those Roys and Beaulieu's, all of those people, of French-Canadian names indicating that they were Michif people, but athletes, if they were to be trusted in the United States. So Ramsay says to these interpreters, you've all got relatives who are chiefs. They're all in their teepees tonight. You go to your relatives and you tell them you'd better sign in the morning. Bottineau goes to Red Bear, his uncle, and he says, Uncle Red Bear, you remember when I was just a boy and you told me why you left Rainy River to come out here on the edge of the prairie to be by the buffalo? And how you got the Indian pony and you mastered the pony and you could ride and you've enjoyed a full life with the pony and the buffalo and the prairie. And you've forgotten about the fish and the wild rice, haven't you, Uncle Bear? Yes, I've forgotten. And Uncle Bear, Uncle Red Bear, you said that change was the best thing, didn't you? Or change would happen. And that's why you came to this area. Didn't you say that, Uncle Bear, when I was just a boy, that change would happen? He says, yes. Well then, Uncle Red Bear, why won't you sign? I said, I'll sign, but I'm losing my land. And he signed the next day. That was